In the long shadow of World War II, history remembers the thunder of tanks, the roar of bombers, the fire of artillery. But hidden beneath all that noise was a quiet heartbeat, a pulse of electricity passing through copper wires, carrying words that shaped continents and crushed empires. That pulse belonged to SIGABA, the cipher machine the Axis never cracked, a device so secret that even many Allied soldiers never knew it existed. And yet, without it, D-Day, Midway, and almost every Allied master plan of the war could have collapsed before they even began. SIGABA was not glamorous. It did not travel into battle atop tanks or soar above the waves on aircraft. It sat on wooden desks inside dimly lit rooms, guarded by locks, steel doors, and men sworn to silence. But it was the strongest weapon the United States possessed against German intelligence, even stronger than the atomic research that would follow, because it protected every plan, every strategy, every order sent through the air and across the sea. The Germans knew of Enigma and believed it was unbreakable. They trusted their machines, their mathematics, their operators, and their patterns. But they never imagined that the United States had built something far more complex, far more unpredictable, far more secure: SIGABA. And unlike Enigma, it never collapsed. SIGABA was born out of fear, a fear the Allies carried after watching Enigma traffic begin to crack under the hands of Polish and then British cryptanalysts. The Americans understood a truth the Germans did not want to accept. No machine, no matter how sophisticated, can remain secure if its patterns repeat. Enigma repeated, SIGABA did not. This was its genius, its heart, its invincibility. The American Army and Navy had long searched for a cipher system that could transmit the highest level of messages without fear that a single captured rotor or a single mistake from an operator would expose entire campaigns. After years of effort, the answer finally emerged: a machine using not one, but 3 systems of rotating wheels arranged in layers that controlled each other in a dance so complicated, even the cryptanalysts who designed it sometimes paused in admiration. Unlike Enigma, SIGABA did not follow predictable steps. The positions of its wheels did not move in regular rhythms. The machine could leap, wheel states, skip increments, reorder internal logic, and shift patterns without warning. Even the operator did not know the true path a cipher rotated through. The machine's unpredictability was not an accident, it was its soul. German codebreakers listening night and day across Europe classified SIGABA traffic as impossible traffic because no matter how they plotted the patterns, no matter how they charted the frequencies, no matter how they strained to pull structure from chaos, every attempt returned the same answer: there was no pattern to crack. The Germans believed for years that the Americans simply relied less on radio for sensitive orders than the British, that they sent fewer high-level messages through the air. They assumed the lack of visible structure meant a lack of important content, never realizing it meant the opposite. The most important commands from Eisenhower, Nimitz, Marshall, and every Allied theater flowed through SIGABA. The Axis could see the messages but could not read a single letter. They were blind. The machine itself looked deceptively simple: a locked steel case, wooden sides, thick crank, rows of rotors like Enigma but arranged in triads, with control wheels, stepping wheels, and cipher wheels all working together in a layered system. Each wheel controlled the motion of the others, preventing any pattern from ever repeating twice. Even capturing a machine would not help, because without matching wheel sets and the cycle keys, the device remained a mute block of metal, a safe without a combination. SIGABA had another advantage. Its output did not create the letter equals letter pairing that betrayed other ciphers. Enigma, for example, never allowed a letter to encode as itself. This limitation helped Allied codebreakers find openings. SIGABA had no such flaw. Every letter could become any letter, including itself. This erased the cryptanalyst foothold the Axis depended on. The more the Germans examined SIGABA messages, the more terrified they became. They did not know what the Allies were saying, they did not know what the Allies were planning, but they could see one thing clearly. The amount of traffic encrypted through SIGABA increased every month, and every time it increased, Allied operations struck with greater force, precision, and unity. In Berlin, some officers began to whisper, "SIGABA must be their master system, the one thing we cannot reach." They were right. SIGABA protected the planning of Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. It protected the buildup for Sicily. It protected decisions made during the bloody months of the Italian campaign. It shielded the coordination between British, American, and Canadian forces that set the stage for the largest amphibious assault in human history. At the height of the war, German intelligence assessed every Allied cipher system, captured or intercepted, and tried to classify their vulnerabilities. When they reached the category reserved for impenetrable systems, they listed only one, the American machine designation M134C, which the Allies called SIGABA. Their notes included a single chilling sentence, "No progress will ever be made." This was not arrogance, it was defeat. Even before the battles ended, Germany had lost the war of cryptography, and they knew it. But the full magnitude of SIGABA's power would become most visible in the months before D-Day. While Allied troops trained across England and Eisenhower and Montgomery shaped their plans, German intelligence searched desperately for clues regarding the timing and location of the invasion. They believed they were skilled at reading Allied patterns. They had broken British ciphers earlier in the war. They had intercepted endless communication across the Channel. But when it came to the true heart of the Allied command structure, the one channel that mattered most, SIGABA shut every door. They listened, but heard nothing. They knew an invasion was coming, but they could not find the when. They could not find the where. They could not find the scale. SIGABA had sealed every intention, every plan, every adjustment in an armor of electrical chaos, and Germany, with all its cryptographic talent, could do nothing against it. In the end, SIGABA was not a machine. It was a shield, an invisible fortress that protected the Allies long enough for their armies to gather, their fleets to sail, and their strategies to unfold. Its silence was its power. Its complexity was its armor. And its existence meant that while the Allies read German secrets, Germany never read theirs. The war of machines, guns, and soldiers was still to come, but the war of ciphers had already been won, and SIGABA stood alone, undefeated, unmatched, and unseen, ready to carry the most important invasion message in history across the Atlantic and into the hands of the man who would command the liberation of Europe.
On the evening of June 5, 1944, a storm rolled across the English Channel. Waves smashed against the steel hulls of landing craft, wind tore at signal flags, and lightning flickered across the horizon. Thousands of ships waited in the darkness, engines humming, soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, unaware that the most fragile part of the entire D-Day plan did not rest on guns, tanks, or ships. It rested on a cipher machine, locked inside steel trunks deep in Allied headquarters. SIGABA was the nervous system of Operation Overlord. Without it, the invasion could not move one step forward. Every order Eisenhower sent, every adjustment Montgomery requested, every intelligence summary, every weather update crossed the channel inside SIGABA's encrypted veins. If even one message leaked to the Germans, Overlord could fail before a single soldier touched French sand. Germany had men, divisions, guns, and bunkers ready along the Atlantic Wall. What they did not have was insight, and that blindness existed because SIGABA never cracked, never buckled, never betrayed a secret. As the storm battered England, Eisenhower sat in Southwick House, staring at the forecasts that would decide the fate of the world. The weather officers argued over winds and cloud ceilings, trying to determine whether the invasion should launch on June 5th or 6th. Communication between the Royal Navy meteorologists, the U.S. 9th Air Force, and Allied Naval Command pulsed through SIGABA. Every corrected chart, every pressure reading, every disagreement passed in total secrecy. German intelligence detected a surge in Allied encrypted messages that night, but the content remained sealed. They guessed the Allies were preparing for something. They guessed an invasion would come someday. They guessed hard, but they never knew the actual answers. SIGABA took guessing off the table. Only the Allies knew the truth. As midnight approached, Eisenhower faced the decision that would define the war: go or cancel. If he canceled and ordered the troops back, it could take weeks to prepare again, and the Germans might discover the plan. If he went, and the weather worsened, thousands could die. He stepped away from the table, hands clasped behind his back, staring into space. Every minute mattered, every second. The channel shifted. Yet when he returned to the table and spoke his famous words, "We go," he had confidence that his message would reach every commander exactly as spoken, unbroken, unread, untouched by enemy eyes. SIGABA carried that message into the night. At exactly 0100 hours, the invasion orders spread from headquarters to every major Allied command. The vast chain lit up with transmissions, each encrypted by SIGABA and then re-encrypted for battlefield radios. Each message identical to the original, not one character altered, not one meaning distorted. Montgomery received the timing for the airborne drops. The U.S. Navy received wave schedules and landing intervals. The 9th Air Force received final target adjustments for pre-invasion bombardment. One machine, a silent metal box, had become the heartbeat that synchronized the largest amphibious assault in human history. On the other side of the channel, German listening posts intercepted more than 24 transmissions during that same hour. They forwarded them to signals intelligence centers where cryptanalysts tried every known technique, but SIGABA remained indifferent. Its output resembled static. Its patterns defied mathematics. It was as if the Americans had wrapped their army inside a cloak of invisible armor. The German high command waited for clues that never came. They scanned for irregularities in British deceptive broadcasts. They tracked fake radio divisions created by Operation Fortitude. They listened to Allied air traffic. But the one stream of messages that actually carried Overlord, the framework, the timings, the decision points, remained sealed in a metal coffin of complexity. By dawn on June 6th, the anvil of the invasion began to fall, and SIGABA held every link together. While paratroopers boarded their C-47s, ground commanders opened their sealed packets, artillery groups prepared counter-battery plans, and landing craft crews looked to final checklists, SIGABA fed them all the same truth at the same moment. Not a second early, not a second late. And the absence of leaks created a catastrophic gap in German readiness. While the Allied chain pulsed with encrypted coordination, the German chain was quiet, silent. Too silent to match what the radar stations soon detected. When the 101st Airborne dropped over Normandy at 0116 hours, the German defenders nearest to the drop zones had received no warning. None of their encrypted intercepts had revealed airborne targets. None had predicted the direction. None had hinted at landing beaches. To the east, the 15th Army still waited near Calais, convinced by decades of German cryptographic arrogance that if the Allies launched such a massive attack, they would surely learn of it by breaking the Allied codes. But they never did, because they never cracked SIGABA. 30 minutes later, when the beaches lit with naval gunfire, signals officers aboard Allied ships received updates through SIGABA streams. The weather shifts, tide levels, and troop positions were updated constantly. SIGABA messages directed the intervention of destroyers that closed within a few hundred yards of Omaha Beach to silence German strongpoints. They directed the release of reserves from floating docks to support Utah. They relayed the shifting wind that threatened airborne resupply by the hour. The machine that lived in silence directed a battle of thunder. On Omaha Beach, the situation nearly collapsed. German machine guns cut down the first waves, soldiers sheltered behind shingle and sand obstacles. Commanders needed artillery, they needed smoke, they needed reinforcements, and all of that depended on the speed of communication. The British commanders offshore needed precise casualty and unit movement updates before pushing their own reinforcements on the beaches further west. SIGABA carried those updates unbroken, unchanged, and instant. American destroyers pushed dangerously close to shore because SIGABA let commanders confirm which units were still alive, which strongpoints remained, and where the naval guns could fire without hitting their own troops. In Berlin, German intelligence interpreted the massive increase in Allied traffic as proof that the invasion at Calais was imminent. Their analysts believed the Allies were still preparing a diversion. No one believed the real invasion was underway until reports came far too late. And even as the German chain of command collapsed under delayed responses and the absence of reliable intelligence, the Allied chain surged with clarity, because SIGABA made clarity possible. By dawn on June 6th, the Allies held 5 footholds in France. They had lost thousands, but they had secured their beginning. And through it all, SIGABA stood at the center, the silent guardian of the invasion. The reason no German knew the hour or the beaches or the scale. The reason the greatest gamble of the war remained hidden until the last second. The reason overlords succeeded before the first soldier even stepped ashore. SIGABA did not fire a shot, but without it, no Allied rifle, no Allied tank, no Allied soldier would have reached Normandy alive.
Long before D-Day crashed into the beaches of Normandy, SIGABA had already proven itself in another theater, thousands of miles away across the vast Pacific. A battlefield not of hedgerows and villages, but of empty ocean horizons, where fleets vanished beyond sight and battles were decided by minutes and miles. SIGABA protected those minutes. It preserved those miles. It shaped the course of 2 decisive battles, Midway and the Philippine Sea, battles where the slightest leak of information could have doomed entire fleets. Midway had already become legend by 1942, but few understood that intelligence victory required 2 shields. The first was the ability to break Japanese codes. The second was ensuring that the Japanese never broke American ones. Breaking JN-25 gave Nimitz a glimpse into the Japanese battle plan, but SIGABA ensured that Nimitz responses to that intelligence remained invisible to the enemy. Without SIGABA, the Japanese might have discovered that their own signals had been compromised, because every American message discussing Japanese carrier movements, every order from Nimitz, every adjustment to scouting patterns, every directive to Spruance and Fletcher was wrapped inside SIGABA's iron cage. The Japanese could see American radio activity, but they could not decipher purpose or meaning. They hunted for patterns, they charted frequencies, they listened to American silence and noise, but nothing revealed Allied intentions. Midway was a battle decided by decision cycles. The Americans acted faster because they read Japanese plans, but equally important, the Japanese could not read American plans. SIGABA erased their ability to anticipate. In the days leading up to Midway, Nimitz shifted his carriers into ambush positions north of the island. He instructed the Marines on Midway to prepare for heavy air assault. He ordered long-range patrols across the northwestern approaches. Each of these decisions moved across SIGABA machines aboard Pearl Harbor and flagships at sea. The Japanese intercepted the transmissions, but saw only chaos. No repeating intervals, no predictable letter patterns, no cracked substitute alphabets. They knew the Americans were planning something, but they could not tell what. When the Japanese carriers approached Midway, they expected to find a surprise attack force, or at least a blind American fleet stumbling without information. Instead, they found American TBD torpedo bombers diving out of the clouds, coordinated with dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. Working with uncanny timing, each wave launched at the exact moment needed to crush the Japanese Navy at its most vulnerable. Their counterintelligence never understood how this timing was possible without American codes being compromised, because in the Japanese mind, superior secrecy belonged to them. They encrypted signals carefully. They believed their fleet coordination was perfect, but they never imagined that American communication was simply too strong to break. The Japanese Navy entered Midway confident that surprise was theirs. SIGABA helped take that surprise away. The Americans did not just know where Japan was going, they ensured Japan never knew where America was. Midway was the first proof the Japanese Navy was brilliant, but blind. 2 years later, in 1944, SIGABA became even more critical as Nimitz prepared for the Marianas Campaign and the battle that would become known as the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
If Midway was a battle decided by reading Japanese secrets, the Philippine Sea was a battle protected by American secrecy. This was a different war. Japan had learned some lessons. They had hardened their ciphers, modified their codes, and intensified radio discipline. Yet their system remained vulnerable. American radio traffic, however, remained sealed behind SIGABA. So successful was the system that the Imperial Japanese Naval Intelligence Division concluded in several reports that the Americans no longer used radio traffic for high-level communication. They assumed communication must be traveling by courier aircraft or underwater cable, because the intercepted SIGABA traffic contained no structure, no entry points, no assumptions to attack. They were listening to a ghost. Before the battle, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, repositioned his carrier several times, reshaping the line of battle to counter what he believed was a Japanese attempt to flank from the west. Each reposition involved dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of lives. The orders passed through SIGABA. When Japan launched the largest air counterstrike of the Pacific War, hundreds of aircraft roaring toward the U.S. Fifth Fleet guided by long-range scouts, they expected to catch Spruance's carriers unprepared. They expected confusion, signals disrupted by distance and speed. They expected the Americans to struggle as they hurriedly adjusted fighter direction tactics. But fighter direction in the Pacific was no longer based on shouted orders from a bridge. It was based on SIGABA instructions, fed through command networks that the Japanese could not penetrate. Thus, when the first wave of Japanese planes appeared on radar, American carriers were already in perfect formation. F-6F Hellcats climbed into the sun, battleships prepared their anti-aircraft batteries, and picket destroyers filled the air with fire. Spruance's radio coordination remained flawless, not because the Japanese failed to jam it, but because they failed to understand it. Multiple Japanese pilots reported shock during their final radio transmissions that the Americans seemed to know exactly where they were, exactly when they were coming, and exactly how to respond so quickly. They suspected leaks, traitors, or some unknown intelligence method, but the truth was simpler. Every American fighter group commander received real-time encrypted position updates through a system Japan could not read. At every step, SIGABA ensured that the battle unfolded exactly as Spruance intended. And in the end, Japan lost more than 400 aircraft in what their pilots called a massacre, fought against a fleet that seemed to anticipate every movement. The Japanese Navy never knew that the Americans were discussing their plans across the airwaves continuously, because SIGABA hid every syllable from them. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did more than cripple Japanese naval aviation. It revealed the devastating asymmetry of cryptographic warfare. By 1944, the Americans could read much of Japan's signals, but the Japanese could interpret nothing from the Americans, and that nothingness was its own brutal weapon. SIGABA was more than a machine. It was a strategic shadow that followed the Fifth Fleet everywhere it went. If the Japanese had broken SIGABA, even partially, Nimitz carrier placements might have been revealed. Spruance's fighter directions might have been predicted. American reinforcements might have been ambushed. But the Japanese never broke it, never understood it, never even approached its outer walls. Midway, the turning point. Philippine Sea, the crushing blow. Two battles shaped by decisions made behind locked cipher wheels, turning in quiet rooms far from gunfire. Rooms where SIGABA guarded every command, every correction, every fleeting thought of the admirals directing the war in the Pacific. SIGABA did not shoot down aircraft, it did not sink carriers, but without it, the men who did those things would have been blind, while the Japanese would have been watching the Americans. They won those battles in part because the enemy never heard them thinking.
By late 1943, the Allied war machine was no longer just a collection of armies, fleets, and air forces. It had become something far more dangerous, a coordinated organism stretching across continents, linked by a nervous system that the Axis could hear but could not understand. Every major operation, from Sicily to Normandy, from the Aleutians to the Solomons, flowed through the encrypted arteries of SIGABA, a machine that did not simply hide information, but created a vast strategic shadow, a darkness inside which the Allies could move unseen while Germany and Japan stumbled blind. Germany prided itself on signals intelligence.
Their code breakers were highly trained, their interception networks extensive, and their analysts experienced. They broke British field ciphers early in the war. They cracked Soviet codes. They exploited Allied carelessness more than once. But the moment they tried to penetrate the highest-level American traffic, they could go no further. Every SIGABA transmission was a sealed vault, and Germany knew it. They called the traffic impossible, not because they could not solve it yet, but because they saw no mathematical doorway to even begin their efforts. The Wehrmacht had built an intelligence apparatus on the assumption that all machines could be cracked given time. Every cipher had patterns. Every code had predictable weaknesses. But SIGABA denied them those assumptions. It produced patterns that did not repeat. It produced keys that followed no rhythm. It produced ciphertext so chaotic that it resembled random noise even to experts. Germany never solved a single message. Not one letter, not one fragment, not one accidental leak. And because they could not read Allied messages, they misread the entire war. In the Mediterranean, SIGABA created some of the greatest deceptions in modern history. When the Allies prepared to invade Sicily, German intelligence believed the invasion would strike Greece or Sardinia. They based their assumptions on troop movements, aerial reconnaissance, and the deceptive broadcasts of Operation Mincemeat. But the most important factor was silence. SIGABA ensured that the real planning discussions, the logistical timetables, the naval movements, the airborne assault coordination, and even the final invasion date remained locked inside unbreakable encryption. When the invasion struck Sicily in July 1943, German generals panicked. Their planning model had collapsed because its foundation, the expectation that they could read at least part of their opponent's intentions, had been ripped from them. The same shadow covered Italy. The landing at Salerno, the assault at Anzio, the deception around the Gustav Line, all protected by SIGABA at every stage. German commanders reported shock at the precision of Allied timing, the concentration of forces, and the coordination between naval, air, and ground units. But the most devastating effect, the one that changed the entire trajectory of the war, came from SIGABA strangling German strategic perception. Germany entered 1944 believing they could predict Allied intentions, because for years they had been conditioned to believe in the power of their intelligence apparatus. They intercepted millions of Allied messages, many using weaker ciphers. They exploited mistakes from inexperienced operators. They collected piles of raw radio traffic. But none of it contained the heart of the Allied war plan, because SIGABA ate the heart. Germany heard the pulse, but never the meaning. And nowhere was this blindness more catastrophic than in the months preceding D-Day. Even before the first landing craft touched the Normandy coast, SIGABA shaped the battlefield not by changing what the Allies did, but by changing what the Germans believed. The Allies executed Operation Fortitude, a massive deception intended to convince Hitler that the invasion would strike Calais. But Fortitude could only succeed if German intelligence remained unable to distinguish real Allied orders from fake ones. SIGABA made that distinction impossible. The authentic orders for Overlord moved through SIGABA, the false ones through open radio deception channels. The Germans could hear the deceptive messages, but could not compare them to the genuine ones because the genuine ones were sealed. Therefore, Germany saw only the shadows, the noise, the stage props, never the truth. And so they placed their Panzer reserves near Calais. They believed Patton commanded a fictitious 1st U.S. Army preparing to strike the Pas de Calais. They believed every Allied movement in southern England reinforced this assumption. They believed the Allies would not attempt a major landing in Normandy at all. They were wrong, because they were blind. SIGABA built that blindness. Every Allied master plan relied on it. In the Pacific, SIGABA played a different but equally devastating role. Japan relied heavily on pattern analysis to predict Allied movements. They monitored radio silence intervals, radio call signs, and unit identifiers. But SIGABA scrambled these patterns so thoroughly that Japanese intelligence often concluded incorrectly that American fleets were scattered or disorganized. In reality, the fleets were coordinated as never before. SIGABA erased the Japanese ability to anticipate the direction of the American thrusts. The Central Pacific, the Philippines, the Marianas, all were shielded behind a cipher the Japanese did not know how to attack. Japanese analysts later wrote that American command networks seemed to operate across impossible distances, with impossible speed, as if they shared one mind. They did not see SIGABA, but they felt its presence in every failed assumption, every misread signal, every shattered attempt to find order on the Allied side. The presence of SIGABA changed the behavior of commanders, generals, and admirals. Generals and admirals no longer feared using radio for their most sensitive messages. They no longer relied on slow couriers, aircraft dispatches, or chaotic telephone lines. They spoke freely across the air, confident that no German, no Japanese officer would ever hear their thoughts. This freedom accelerated Allied coordination in ways no enemy could match, allowing dispersed armies to behave with unity, allowing fleets spread across hundreds of miles to turn as one, allowing air forces to strike millions of square miles of ocean and land without revealing their patterns. When German officers studied their failures after the war, they blamed many things: shortages, fuel, weather, Hitler's interference. But buried inside their reports lies the quiet admission that drove German codebreakers to despair. We could not see what the enemy was planning because their highest messages were hidden from us behind a machine we never cracked. They believed their failure was partial, but the truth was worse. It was total. SIGABA had not merely protected messages. It had protected the entire mental world of the Allied command structure. Every idea, every strategy, every adaptation was shielded inside a cipher so strong that it created a dark envelope around the Allies' movements, a strategic shadow under which the greatest operations of the war took shape.
By the time the war entered its final year, the Allies possessed an overwhelming arsenal. Tanks that rolled across Europe, fleets that spanned oceans, bombers that darkened skies. But hidden beneath all those symbols of power was a quieter force, one that never fired a bullet, never sank a ship, never brought down a plane, and yet shaped the outcome of the war more profoundly than many weapons that did. SIGABA, the machine the Axis never cracked, the silent guardian of every Allied master plan. As 1945 approached, SIGABA had already proven its value, again and again. At Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Normandy, it had been carried ashore on beaches, guarded in bunkers, shipped aboard command vessels, and installed in every headquarters where the war was truly fought. Inside the minds of leaders, its rotors turned night and day, encoding messages from Eisenhower, Marshal Nimitz, Arnold, Montgomery, and every senior commander who shaped the Allied advance. As the Allies pushed toward Berlin and Tokyo, SIGABA protected the last great campaigns, crossing the Rhine, coordinating the Ardennes counteroffensive response, directing maritime operations in the Pacific, adjusting B-29 targeting under the changing weather patterns of the Marianas, even negotiating the deployment of replacement divisions and fuel convoys. SIGABA was everywhere because its silence made everything else possible. When the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, they hoped to split the Allied lines, create confusion, sever communication, and collapse coordination. But even in that crisis, SIGABA held the Allied command structure together. American and British units responded faster than German planners believed possible, because high-level commands moved through SIGABA channels untouched by the chaos of the front. In the critical first days, Eisenhower, Marshall, and field commanders exchanged assessments, reinforcements, and artillery redistribution orders with absolute security, while German signals intelligence intercepted nothing but indecipherable static. This security allowed the Allies to regain the initiative. Shock hardened into clarity. Disorder resolved into unity once more. A quiet machine helped stop a loud offensive. In the Pacific,
SIGABA played an equally decisive role in the final island battles around Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the approaches to Japan. The Japanese High Command searched desperately for patterns in Allied movements, hoping to anticipate landings, aircraft deployments, or the timing of B-29 strikes. But SIGABA ensured that the Allied tactical and strategic planning networks remained impenetrable. Japanese analysts grew increasingly convinced that the Americans had abandoned radio entirely for top-secret communication, never realizing that the most sensitive messages were flowing through the air in front of them, rendered invisible by SIGABA's design. In Tokyo, as in Berlin, the strategic shadow held firm even as cities burned, shipyards fell, and airfields vanished. The same silence surrounded preparations for the largest planned invasion of the Pacific, Operation Downfall. The operation that never came, but required more coordination, more secrecy, and more logistical planning than any amphibious assault in human history. SIGABA was ready for it. Commanders from MacArthur and Nimitz to the Joint Chiefs planned downfall using the same Cipher machine that had shielded Overlord from Axis eyes. If downfall had been executed, millions of troops would have depended on SIGABA to guide them ashore. Japan would have been unable to predict landing zones or diversionary tactics because the Cipher would have protected the planning, just as it had in Europe. When historians study the war, they often point to code-breaking triumphs like Enigma or JN-25, yet they sometimes overlook an equally important truth. The Allies won not only because they read enemy messages, but because the enemy never read theirs. SIGABA closed the most dangerous door of all, the door leading into the Allied strategic mind. Without SIGABA, German intelligence might have discovered the real invasion site or date in France. Japan might have predicted the movements of carrier task forces. The Allies might have hesitated to use radio, and coordination across vast distances would have crumbled. The United States had built a machine that not only encrypted information, but enabled a new style of warfare: decentralized, mobile, flexible, and fast. It allowed the Allies to coordinate armies separated by oceans, fleets stretched across the horizon, and air forces spanning half the globe. The machine itself was unassuming, a box with rotors and switches and wires, carried in cases guarded like treasure, and operated by men who rarely spoke about their work. After the war, the secrecy surrounding SIGABA remained so deep that for decades its story lay buried beneath classified documents. It did not earn medals, it did not become a household name, but its legacy shaped the post-war world. The National Security Agency inherited its principles. The Cold War cryptographic systems took its lessons to heart, and modern digital encryption still owes a subtle debt to the architecture first proven inside SIGABA rotors in 1940. It lived on quietly, resisting time, just as it had resisted the Axis. Finally, when veterans looked back decades later, many realized that SIGABA had been the one constant that never failed. Radar jammed, guns overheated, tanks broke down, engines stalled, but SIGABA never cracked. Not one letter, not one word. And in the brutal mathematics of war, that record mattered more than any single weapon could. As the war ended, generals returned home, fleets were decommissioned, armies dissolved. But SIGABA remained a symbol of the silent front, the front where no one fired a shot, but where victory was no less decisive. And perhaps it was fitting that such a machine never asked for recognition. It simply turned its rotors in quiet rooms behind locked doors night after night, protecting secrets that would shape the world to come. Without SIGABA, German intelligence might have discovered the real invasion site or date in France. Japan might have predicted the movements of carrier task forces. The Allies might have hesitated to use radio, and coordination across vast distances would have crumbled. The United States had built a machine that not only encrypted information, but enabled a new style of warfare: decentralized, mobile, flexible, and fast. It allowed the Allies to coordinate armies separated by oceans, fleets stretched across the horizon, and air forces spanning half the globe. The machine itself was unassuming, a box with rotors and switches and wires, carried in cases guarded like treasure, and operated by men who rarely spoke about their work.